formal complaint about Nicola Sturgeon lodged with the head of the Scottish Civil Service, Leslie Evans, by the former deputy leader of the Scottish National Party, Jim Sillars. Dear Mrs. Evans, I wish to lodge a complaint of breaches of the Ministerial Code by the First Minister on Wednesday the 24th of February 2021. The substance of the complaint and the facts it is based upon are set out below. As the complaint could be seen as being in the context of matters being examined by the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry, to which you have given evidence, you may think it inappropriate for you to be the official dealing with this complaint. If that is so, then I request that the next person in seniority should take this as addressed to them. I would like to be informed of who will deal with this complaint, should it not be you. In her daily press briefings on the pandemic, the First Minister has consistently refused to answer questions on issues other than COVID-19. Yesterday, however, instead of refusing to respond to questions on matters irrelevant to the purpose of the press briefing on COVID-19, she deliberately chose to do so, not once but 5 times. It can be seen here, link to BBC iPlayer inserted. You will note, quote, coronavirus briefing, end quote. The national broadcaster was in no doubt of the purpose of the First Minister's appearance. These briefings have all along had only one purpose. The timings show her response to questions which were asked as the briefing continued. I have had them double-checked as to times. 30 minutes 20. Question from James Matthew, Sky News. The First Minister spoke for 48 seconds on what can fairly be described as the Salmond issue. 32 minutes 57. Question from Peter Smith, ITV. The First Minister spoke for 5 minutes 16 seconds on the Salmond issue. 52 minutes 49. Question from Simon Johnson, Daily Telegraph. The First Minister spoke for 1 minute 36 seconds on the Salmond issue. 1 hour mark. Question from Michael Blackley, Daily Mail. The First Minister spoke for 52 seconds on the Salmond issue. In total, she spent over 9 minutes of a meeting called to inform the public, through the media, including BBC television, of the government's continuing action on the pandemic crisis, not to express her views on clearly separate matters arising from the parliamentary inquiry. The meaning of that paragraph is, of course, she spent over 9 minutes devoted to Salmond improperly. Of course, the First Minister was not to know that the first question from James Matthew was not about COVID-19 and government policy in dealing with it. But she did not, as on previous occasions, refuse to answer and restate the purpose the briefing was convened for. Nor did she do that when the second question came from Peter Smith and the others. The only conclusion that can be drawn from her action from 30 minutes 20 on points to it being no accident, a deliberate choice. When I state the Salmond issue above, I mean what can be seen from the BBC iPlayer. A sustained attack on Mr. Salmond, on matters relevant to the parliamentary inquiry, but not remotely connected to a COVID briefing. The complaint is, therefore, based on the attacks on Mr. Salmond in a forum that had been arranged by the Scottish Government to inform the public on a subject, the pandemic, a matter of serious public concern, in which maximum publicity would be given to the words of the First Minister. It is a gross breach of her duty to use that government-sponsored forum for a public attack on Mr. Salmond in matters not related to the purpose of a briefing to which the media had been invited. I submit that it is a breach of the ministerial code to allow and then use a public health COVID briefing to launch an attack on Mr. Salmond in the context of matters arising from the parliamentary inquiry. By her conduct, as recorded by the BBC, she is in flagrant breach of Clause 1 of the Ministerial Code and Clause 10 governing the conduct of ministers and the presentation of policy. It is not for me to question a decision by the First Minister to make a public attack on Mr. Salmond, but if she wished to do so, then she could have arranged a press conference on the subject, which would have been the proper and legitimate forum in which to do so. Abusing the government COVID briefing was neither proper nor legitimate. That is where the code has been breached. However, there are additional breaches of the code which are quite extraordinary, unique in their gravity, and a matter of deep concern for all who understand the implications of what the First Minister said in those 9 minutes. During her attacks on Mr. Salmond, she said, quote, "The behaviour complained of was found by a jury not to constitute criminal conduct, and Alex Salmond is innocent of criminality, but that doesn't mean that the behaviour they complained of didn't happen, and I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that." End quote. Unlike the First Minister, who did not attend Mr. Salmond's trial, the jury was there for every second. They saw Mr. Salmond cross-examined, precisely denying that the alleged behaviour happened. The jury saw and heard prosecution witnesses under cross-examination. The jury's conclusion, with a majority of women on it, was to acquit Mr. Salmond. If, as the First Minister states, the jury's verdict means that the complaints they had before them in evidence did in fact happen, then the only logical conclusion you can draw from her words is that the jury was wrong in its verdict 13 times. Those were weasel words employed by the First Minister, and any reasonable person would draw more than an inference from them that the jury was wrong. The first clause of the Ministerial Code states that, quote, "Scottish ministers are expected to maintain high standards of behaviour and to behave in a way that upholds the highest standards of propriety." End quote. The First Minister's comment on the trial verdict breached those standards. I have been in public life for over 60 years, and in the course of it studied how heads of state and governments in the democracies have behaved in office. I cannot recall one single incident when the head of a government so egregiously questioned the verdict of a jury, or even thought it a proper and legitimate discharge of their duty to do so. It is vital to the health of a democracy that government, more than any other part of our society, maintain a scrupulous distance between it and intervention, even post-trial intervention, in our criminal justice system. That is the standard reflected in Clause 1.1 of the Code. Clause 1.3 states, inter alia, that ministers, quote, "should uphold the administration of justice," end quote. The First Minister knowingly breached those parts of the Code with her comments on the trial. I submit that there is overwhelming evidence that on several counts the First Minister has engaged deliberately in grave breaches of the Ministerial Code. Jim Sillars.